Welcome. This lecture will focus on the last two sections of Chapter 4, 4.6 and 4.7. So we've now gone through kind of all of the kind of major tissue types. We're going to finally talk about an organ. Yay! And actually, we've already talked about an organ, you just didn't know it when we were talking about our serous membranes. So we have three major types of covering and lining membranes. Our cutaneous membrane, which is our skin, which is considered a dry membrane, and then the mucous membranes and the serous membranes, which are considered wet or moist membranes. So they're more fluidy than our skin. These are simple organs, so it's usually some type of epithelium with then a little bit of underlying connective tissue proper of some sort, like areola or dense irregular or something like that. The cutaneous membrane is what is covering the surface of the body, so we're talking about, of course, our skin. It is stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and then areolar and dense irregular underneath. The mucous membranes actually vary in terms of their epithelial type and underlying connective tissue type, and then the serous membranes are simple squamous and just a little bit of dense irregular or areolar underneath. The mucosae, or the mucous membranes, are lining kind of the body cavities that are open to the environment. So things like the GI tract, the respiratory tract, the urinary tract, the reproductive tract, whereas the serous membranes line the body cavities that are closed to the exterior. So we're talking about those ventral body cavities that we find, the pleurae for holding the lungs, the pericardium for holding the heart, and then the peritoneum for holding the abdominal organs and lining the abdominal cavity. So one dry membrane, two kind of wet, moist membranes, but these are very, very, very kind of simple, basic organs. The other bit of Chapter 4 is about tissue repair. Tissue repair is necessary, of course, because if we damage our tissues, we want some way to fix them, right? We don't want to just leave the damage there unfixed. So this is particularly important if we have our kind of external barriers penetrated. We want some way to repair stuff. So we have to have a way of getting our cells to go through mitosis, getting our cells to divide, and kind of migrate into the damaged areas. And the tissue repair process is kind of a three-step process, and generally results in two outcomes: regeneration or fibrosis. Regeneration is when the damaged tissue is replaced by whatever tissue was damaged. So if it's bone tissue that was damaged, if you break a bone, it's bone tissue after it has healed. You've got complete functionality, completely restored. Looks and functions just as it did before the damage. Fibrosis is when connective tissue replaces the damaged tissue. So let's say you have a heart attack and that damages some of your cardiac muscle in your heart. Well, rather than the cardiac muscle that was damaged being replaced with nice new healthy cardiac muscle, instead we get fibrotic, fibrous connective tissue, scar tissue, and at that point you do not have the same functionality, right? Dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue is not cardiac muscle, so it's not going to function like cardiac muscle, and so that's not quite as, shall we say, useful in terms of repair functions. As I mentioned, it is a three-step process. The first step has to do with blood flow, as the kind of opening video in this chapter talks about. It is inflammation. When blood vessels are damaged, they release a whole host of inflammatory chemicals that make the blood flow just to that local area better, faster. The blood vessels become more permeable. The blood flow to that particular area is faster. And that seems kind of counterintuitive, except as the blood is flowing to the damaged area, it's bringing plasma proteins, it's bringing antibodies, it's bringing white blood cells, and clotting proteins and other kind of macrophages that can eat stuff, and new body cells kind of into the area so they can start mitosising and repairing the damaged tissue, and so it's actually a very useful thing, and blood flow is completely necessary in order for tissue repair to function properly. So the tissues that don't have an adequate blood flow are generally harder to repair. The exception to that are epithelial tissues, and that's just because they have a super high rate of mitosis. Typically, during this inflammation stage, eventually the blood will clot so that you're not internally bleeding or externally bleeding. If you do have an injury that's exposed to the air, typically you will then get a scab forming. The second stage is called organization, and it really is what starts to kind of knit everything back together. So the clot of blood is replaced by something called granulation tissue. It's this kind of unformed, kind of fluffy tissue. It's fairly undifferentiated type tissue, but we'll get some collagen fibers kind of spanning the gap, get some macrophages in the area that can kind of eat the debris. Epithelial cells that are in the area will multiply and divide and kind of cover up whatever, and start to replace whatever epithelial tissues in the area were damaged. That restores our blood flow and starts to kind of knit the tissue back together. And if you've ever had a cut or anything, and you've ever paid attention to how your cuts heal, you'll see like the newly healed tissue is not as like resilient looking. It always looks a little fragile, right? That's granulation tissue. And then the third step is where our paths diverge. If it's a tissue that is really good at healing itself, then regeneration will occur. If it's a tissue that's not so good at healing itself, then fibrosis will occur. Now, unfortunately for us, two of the tissues that are the worst at repairing themselves are actually two of the most important, and that's our heart and our brain. So in terms of tissues that regenerate super easily and well, epithelial tissues, of course, they just have a super high rate of mitosis, so it's just really easy for them to regenerate. Bone regenerates quite easily. I broke 3 bones in I broke my 2 leg bones in 3 places, and I was in a cast, boot really, for about 3 months. I think it was 3 months. But after the 3 months, I was able to get the boot off and start walking around again. So it's a slow process for bone to repair itself, but bone does repair itself quite well. Areolar tissue, got lots of blood vessels, so it repairs itself really well. Same thing with dense irregular connective tissue. It regenerates pretty well too. And then of course the blood forming tissues you are literally constantly making new blood cells all the time. In terms of kind of middle of the road, middle of the pack in terms of regeneration, smooth muscle's not so hot at it, and dense regular connective tissue is really not so good at it. So when I tore my anterior cruciate ligament in my knee, I actually had it replaced, because those are my 2 options. Physical therapy, and I will get my full functionality back, but my knee might occasionally spasm out, or having it replaced and not having a problem with it. And so I chose to have it replaced because the ligament does not heal itself super well, but not terribly. But again, the 2 tissues that just absolutely are really just incredibly, incredibly awful at regeneration are cardiac muscle and the nervous tissue in our brain and our spinal cord. The heart and the brain, right? 2 really important organs, and unfortunately they are just terrible. They have virtually no regenerative capacity at all. Now, the nervous tissue in your limbs, in the trunk, outside of the brain and spinal cord and the nerves, it is kind of moderate in terms of its regeneration. It's really slow. It does kind of get full functionality back and does regenerate, but that's a super slow process. When I had surgery to have my ACL replaced, they made a little incision on my shin, and I lost some sensation in that area, and I didn't get it back for years. I did eventually get it back, but not for a really long time. So nerve tissue is incredibly slow at regeneration, and unfortunately, nerve tissue in the brain or the spinal cord, which is why traumatic brain injuries are so damaging, spinal cord injuries are so damaging, and then the heart muscle, they're just awful at regeneration. If you have a heart attack and damage your heart, you're much more likely to then subsequently have another heart attack. So, unfortunately, it's pretty unfortunate. However, there have been some successes in using stem cells. These are what we call pluripotent, many potents, many potentials. These are undifferentiated embryonic cells that we find in the body, and they are not yet a specific type of cell in the body. And so if we can coax them to be brain cells or spinal cord cells or even heart muscle cells, and we can kind of graft those kind of new tissues into the old ones, then we have some potential for treating some of these kind of brain and heart diseases that we don't yet have really good treatments for. So, but hopefully if we make some progress with our stem cells, that's why some people like to save their baby's cord blood, because it has a lot of their embryonic stem cells in it. But definitely a really cool and interesting and very promising line of research.